Aaron Gunches and Arizona's death penalty dilemma: execution or state-assisted suicide. What if the process meant to deliver justice became a tool for systemic flaws, unchecked mental health struggles, and moral ambiguity? This is the chilling reality surrounding Aaron Gunches, a man on Arizona's death row. But his story is not just his own. It's one that exposes deep cracks in America's death penalty system. Gunches has requested his own execution date, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions. Are we witnessing justice, or are we allowing an ethically compromised system to spiral further out of control? Grab your seat, true crime enthusiasts. Today, we're peeling back the layers of one man's decision for death and what it reveals about the chilling operation of Arizona's capital punishment machine. Aaron Gunches stands as the central figure in this haunting narrative. Convicted of murder and sentenced to death in Arizona, his case took an unexpected twist when he submitted an unprecedented request to speed up his execution by asking for a February date. But why would someone on death row rush toward their own death? Experts believe the answer lies in the concept of so-called volunteer executions. These occur when death row inmates forego appeals and essentially consent to their death by state execution. It's an unsettling concept: volunteers for death. But is this really consent? Or is it desperation born from unchecked mental illness, overwhelming psychological pain, and endless isolation? In Gunches' case, no jury has ever uncovered the truth of his life history. We know nothing about the childhood trauma, mental health battles, or physical abuse that could have shaped his path to crime. This, despite the judiciary's responsibility to consider such factors under the law. Instead, Gunches was deemed competent to represent himself twice, leaving his story silenced along with his humanity. Now, knowing little about the man himself, Arizona is hurtling toward granting him his wish. But behind this macabre request lies a system in free fall. Arizona's lethal injection protocol has long been a lightning rod for controversy. Numerous botched executions have brought global scrutiny, as procedural failures have turned supposed humane procedures into horrifying spectacles. Think back to Joseph Wood in 2014, a grotesque tragedy where it took 15 excruciating doses of drugs and over 2 hours to end a life. Arizona's system has repeatedly proven unreliable, riddled with mismanagement and inhumane outcomes. And now, Aaron Gunches' request revives these haunting memories, further spotlighting a protocol some say borders on cruel or unusual punishment. For years, critics have implored Arizona to reckon with its problematic death penalty practices. Yet, here we are again, watching the system inch closer toward another controversial execution. This isn't just about Gunches. This is about how a state continues to carry out the ultimate punishment under ongoing ethical and functional failures. With Aaron Gunches requesting his execution, are we truly ensuring justice, or are we letting a broken system carry out retribution without accountability? Aaron Gunches isn't the first volunteer. Across the U.S., inmates have made this haunting choice to expedite their death sentence. But let's take a closer look. Are they actually volunteering, or are these decisions born out of systemic neglect and despair? Death row is a punishing reality. Years of isolation, relentless mental anguish, and the finality of knowing you will be executed. For some inmates like Gunches, volunteering appears to be an escape, not from guilt, but from the torturous wait for death. Here's where the moral ambiguity deepens. When the state agrees to these requests, are they complicit in abetting state-assisted suicide? Instead of reviewing the mental stability of such decisions, the gears of the justice system spin forward without regard to mental illness, trauma, or the role these factors might play in accepting death over life. It's easier for the system to execute someone like Gunches than it is to admit its failures in properly considering his humanity. For critics, volunteer executions represent a failure to uphold justice. After all, isn't the purpose of justice to rehabilitate or ensure fairness, rather than to facilitate desperation? The U.S. Supreme Court has been clear. Mitigation evidence, The details of a defendant's life history, mental health, trauma, and other circumstances must be properly considered for a constitutional death sentence. But in Gunches' case, that never happened. No jury has ever heard his story. No one evaluated how his upbringing, relationships, or even undiagnosed mental illnesses might have contributed to his crime. Without these critical insights, the question must be asked: was Gunches even truly eligible for the death penalty in the first place? And how many others on death row share a similar fate, stripped of the opportunity to have their stories represented before the ultimate punishment is imposed? This failure isn't unique to Gunches. It's a systemic problem in America's death penalty apparatus, one that disproportionately impacts the marginalized and mentally ill. How many more lives will the system take before these failures are rectified? Aaron Gunches' case transcends his individual story. It represents a crossroads for Arizona, a state marred by its history of controversial executions. If the state proceeds with Gunches' request, it raises more significant questions. What does this set as a precedent? Arizona already struggles to demonstrate transparency and consistency in carrying out executions. By rushing toward Gunches' request without adequately addressing mental health or ethical concerns, the state risks normalizing volunteer executions as a default way to declutter death row, rather than addressing systemic flaws. Other states are watching. What happens in Arizona could easily shape the national conversation around capital punishment practices, ethical boundaries, and whether it's time to abolish the death penalty altogether. When Aaron Gunches asked for his execution, the public response ranged from outrage to indifference. True crime enthusiasts have dissected his case, some raising the alarm, while others dismiss his request as the logical follow-through for a condemned man. But for death row reform activists and legal experts, Gunches' case is far from closed. Advocacy groups argue that the death penalty is inhumane and rife with inequalities. They view Gunches' volunteer status as yet another sign of the system's failure to protect the mentally ill or those incapable of navigating complicated legal landscapes. These groups continue to demand transparency and protocols that ensure dignity, even under the grim banner of capital punishment. Arizonans, specifically, face the uncomfortable task of reconciling their state's tarnished history of botched executions with the question of whether Gunches' case reflects an act of justice or of pure cruelty. The death penalty has long teetered on the fine line between justice and moral failure. Aaron Gunches' case shines a harsh light on just how blurred that line has become. Executing someone without properly examining their mental state or life story is not justice. It's a moral compromise. By allowing Gunches to request death without deeper institutional reviews, Arizona permits its capital punishment system to become less about justice and more about convenience. Volunteer or not, Gunches is a product of systemic neglect. One more name in a growing list of people whose lives are extinguished, not purely because of what they've done, but because a flawed system let them slip through the cracks. This is more than one man's story. It's a reflection of every failure that currently exists in America's death penalty framework. As the clock ticks toward February, Aaron Gunches' case demands a response, not just from Arizona or the courts, but from everyone watching. True crime fans, advocates, and the general public must ask themselves some hard questions. Can the death penalty ever be truly just in a broken system? Should mental illness and unresolved trauma disqualify individuals from facing execution? Where do we, as a society, draw the line between punishment and moral failure? Gunches' case should ignite outrage and discussion. It's time to demand transparency, ethical oversight, and systemic reform. Because one day, it might not be Aaron Gunches on death row. It could be someone whose story, like his, was never fully told. Justice isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be fair. And as Arizona hurdles towards an uncertain February execution, we have to ask ourselves if, in cases like this, justice can even exist.